Hello, welcome to another video of Sacred Writings. My name is Jason Damiani, and today I will be going over my 13th century illuminated Bible. Well guys, we are in for a treat today. The leaf that I have in my collection is one of the more beautiful leaves that I have. I, of course, love leaves that have stunning artwork and great character to them, and so this leaf is certainly no exception to that. It is almost 800 years old and is quite rare. The leaf that I have is in manuscript form. A manuscript simply means any document that would be handwritten. So a printed leaf, of course, is not considered a manuscript because it was printed basically by a machine or some kind of mechanical device like they would have in the 1400s. But this particular leaf is in manuscript form, which all the videos I've done leading up to this have all been printed leaves. So this makes this leaf much rarer and much more unique and valuable. I'll show you what the leaf looks like here. This is the leaf that I have in my collection. I have multiple leaves like this, so I won't be super detailed about everything that goes on with these leaves. I'll touch on different aspects of these leaves in later videos, and so it'll almost be like a series because I'll touch on the other leaves that I have. And so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of those videos when they come out. But the leaf here is from the year 1250. That's when they date these because it was very common and very popular for these leaves to be made and produced during that time in history. The leaf is very detailed. It has a lot of illuminations, and you'll notice these two boxes here, these chapter headings. These would be called miniatures. These were also done by hand. They were painted by hand. They were designed and put into this, and you have to think about even the scribe, as he was writing this manuscript, would have had to purposely leave a blank space in the text to be able to fit these miniatures in there. So it was a very intentional process and very detailed, and everything was planned out from the slaughter of the animal all the way up to the binding of the book. We'll talk a little bit more about the material as we go on in the video, but I do find it helpful to provide the passage of the leaf that I have. As a believer, it's something that I find very interesting and to be very applicable, since this whole channel is focused and centered around collecting the Bible, and so I like to go into what passage this is. So the passage in question here is Daniel chapters 13 and 14 and an introductory editorial to the book of the prophet Hosea. Now, if you're a good student of the Bible, you may have caught yourself saying, Daniel chapter 13 and 14, I thought there was only 12. Well, you would be correct. Daniel chapters 13 and 14 are considered apocryphal writings, sometimes even referred to as pseudepigraphal. So these chapters are not inspired, and they didn't make it into the canon of Scripture, but the apocryphal books of the Bible would contain these chapters in Daniel. And so Daniel 13 and 14, of course there's a broader context to it, but you'll often see the book titled Bel and the Dragon, that tells of the story of the Jewish hero, i.e. Daniel, who refuses to worship the god Bel and kills the dragon. Thus, he's being forced into a den of lions, which he then is allowed to leave after 7 days because he was unharmed or untouched by the lions in the den. His enemies and advocates of idolatry are later cast into the den and devoured. So it's very similar to the story that takes place earlier in the book, but of course, when Daniel's thrown in the lion's den, it's because he would not refuse to pray. He made sure that prayer was an important, integral part of his life, and so he was disobeying the king's rule and was eventually put into the lion's den because of that. And so, although it's a very intriguing and very interesting story, I would highly recommend you read it because it is quite entertaining, for lack of better terms. I've read it, I find it really enjoyable, and so really cool, interesting to see because it is an old writing. It's just simply not Scripture. So that is a bit of a disadvantage, I guess. It's something that I don't love about this leaf because I love to collect the inspired words of Scripture, of the Bible. When I found that out, I was like, oh, okay, that's not great, but it still is from a Bible, and it still is very rare and unique. So I am very happy with it, and I do love the beauty that comes along with this leaf. And you'll be able to see in the close-ups these miniatures in better detail. But this second miniature is two little dragons, like two heads of a dragon, basically facing each other. Like I said, you'll see it better in the close-ups. But that is directly tied into the story Bel and the Dragon. Daniel, of course, slaying that dragon. And so here's the backside of the leaf as well. I know I haven't really shown it yet, but great artwork there. I absolutely love it. Again, keeping in mind that this was handwritten and hand illuminated. So everything about this is made tediously and strenuously by people almost 800 years ago. And so this leaf is based on Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin. It's called the Latin Vulgate. Since the early 4th century, all the Bibles basically up until like Tyndale basically made his English translation of the Bible, they all were Latin Vulgate Bibles, and even a lot of those English translations were based on Jerome's Latin Vulgate. But by the early 4th century, there were confusing and a wide variety of scriptures in Latin and other languages, the primary one being Latin. These translations were based on the Greek text, but they were based in an unpolished way. They were basically literal translations, or they call transliteration, where you basically take the Greek word and then you do the exact, in their case, Latin word below it, and then they would just have this stiff reading of the text, and it didn't flow together. It didn't really make much sense, because if you do Greek, I've taken Greek before, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, here's this word translated this way, here's this word translated this way. The whole sentence works together. The endings of words make a huge difference in how we interpret and translate the text, and you can't just have them in the order that the Greek falls in. You got to basically mix it up to make sense in the language that we speak. Of course, I'm speaking English, and so when I translate the Greek text, you have to be very intentional about how you organize and translate that sentence. But these translations were not in any single formulation. They were messy. Anyone could do it. Everyone was doing it. If they could speak or read both languages, they would try and make a translation. Augustine of Hippo said, "In the early days of the faith, every man who happened to gain possession of a Greek manuscript and who imagined that he had any faculty in both languages dared to make a translation." And I really love the way he kind of captures that there. Of course, he's exaggerating a little bit, but it really gets the point across that anybody that can get their hands on the documents or the manuscripts would just, and they had any inkling of training in that language, they would just, okay, well, I guess I'll make my translation. And it became a mess. So there, of course, was a major need for someone to come up with a uniform, good flowing, and natural reading of the text. Latin was the most popular language for a lot of history, and so especially in this time of Jerome, and so that's when we have Jerome making his Latin translation of the Bible, and then it kind of goes on from there. Again, I'll touch on that in more detail in other videos, but that's just a brief explanation of the translation that this Bible leaf has, and a little bit of history behind at least the type of text that this is based off of. So, very important aspect of history, and there's a lot of great details that comes along with that. Now, who wrote this leaf? If I know who wrote it, if I know their name, if I know any history about them, I like to get that if I can. Unfortunately for this leaf, I don't have the exact name of the person who wrote it. These manuscripts, especially from this time, weren't signed and dated even by the people who wrote them. It was pretty rare for that to happen. There are some books and some manuscripts that have the author's name. You'll have the monk who wrote it basically saying, this person spent X amount of years writing this manuscript, and they might throw a little joke in there. If you know anything about illuminated manuscripts or just manuscripts in general from the medieval period, they did have a sense of humor. They had some pretty funny miniatures in their writings, and so not all of them were directly tied to the text. Sometimes whoever was straining over the text and writing the little miniature there would have sometimes put comedy into it. And so you'll see some of that with some of the people who wrote their names in it. But unfortunately this one, I don't have the name of the monk who did it, but I do know that it was a monk in a scriptorium, and it would have been a dimly lit scriptorium, very difficult for the monk to see and to write, so they didn't want to damage the leaves, especially with fire being around, so the lighting was not ideal at all. But the monks had to basically sit over their desk, and they had to write every single little letter down. They had to make sure that it was perfect and that there were no mishaps or reading over the text, doing double portions of something that just copied. And so what they would do is they basically have this angled desk where they would have even horns of ink set into the desk where they could easily take their quill and dip into the ink there to copy the text. And so they would have this leaf, this size, on their desk, and they would lay it down at an angle like this, and then up, and the platform here would be the Bible that they were copying. And so they would have the pages opened up to what they needed, and they would take their manuscript like this, and they would take very, very small writing. Even with the naked eye, when I'm looking at it this close, it's hard to make out those letters. So it's amazing the detail and the ability to be able to write that small and be able to read it is quite impressive. It's something that I find very challenging. Actually, when I try and translate these leaves, I find myself taking a picture with my phone and zooming in so I can see the letters better because they just are so small. I mean, you can see the amount of lines of text on here on this small, it's about 7 inches tall. It's just amazing the amount of work that went into this. But these monks would devote their lives to the productions of religious books and, of course, the Bible, which we have here. And copying the text was no easy task, to say the least. Less than 2% of Europe's population during this time were literate, and so the monks were part of an elite group of intellectuals who had this ability to read and to write. So that's a rare thing and was hard to come by. But the process of producing books varied from monastery to monastery. Some places had the monk do the whole process, from getting the parchment to getting the ink made and writing it down and doing the miniatures and putting it into the binding and all the whole process, whereas other monasteries would have more of like a conveyor belt factory type of thing where you'd have one person devoted to just prepping the parchment, and you'd have another person devoted to maybe making the ink while the other one writes it, and then they have the person who would write the text, and then you have someone else who would go and put in the illuminations. Unfortunately, I don't know for this particular leaf what went into it, if it was produced by one person or if it was done through the course of multiple people. That's unfortunately something that I don't have with me on this particular leaf. But there's a lot more I can say on this, but I'm not going to go into too much detail, so I'll touch on that in other videos. But this, as I mentioned, was written by a monk, and the location in which it came from was Paris, France. Paris, France, you'll find, is a very common place for a lot of these medieval manuscripts to come from. I think, if I can remember correctly, all the manuscripts that I have and have owned, I've sold some, were all made in Paris, France. So very popular place for these leaves to come from, but it is interesting nonetheless. Now, is there any significance to this particular leaf, right? I have this leaf here. What's the significance to it? The first one is just simply its age. It's 772 years old, which makes any item that you may have very rare and certainly of value because of its age. So that's the first area of significance to it. The second one would be that it is handwritten. This truly is one of a kind. Because it's not printed, it is unlike any other manuscript in the world because it was hand done, so of course the spacing will be different from manuscript to manuscript. The illuminations may be a little bit different. They just done different designs, especially on this center part here. Like if they were to mirror this decorative initial in the middle, it may look different from leaf to leaf. So it really is one of a kind, so being handwritten definitely brings some value to it and some significance to it. Thirdly, which I kind of touched on, but these two miniatures, these hand-painted things, are very significant because of the amount of detail and work that would have went into it. Trying to find something like this online with especially these two types of illuminations or miniatures. I keep calling them miniatures because that's most commonly what they're referred to as, basically miniature paintings or drawings. And so that is certainly significant in and of itself. There is basically the main aspect that at least I can think of that would make this particular leaf significant, because I don't know who it was by or what exact date it may have been on. I can basically just go off of what I can see and what I can observe of it, and that is that it's old, it's handwritten, and the paintings are hand done as well. So again, this is dated to 1250, but it can certainly have been earlier or a little bit later. It's not like every single manuscript from the 13th century was all done in the year 1250, especially because copying and making these manuscripts took anywhere from a year to 3 years, give or take. Sometimes it take even longer, sometimes it take less time, depending on the detail of the leaf and the requirements of it, or of the Bible itself. But approximately 1 to 3 years, depending on who was all involved and how much work was devoted to it. Now, what are the materials that were used? I touched on this a little bit throughout the video, but this leaf is made of parchment, that is animal skin, or vellum. Vellum specifically refers to calf skin, whereas parchment is a catch-all term because it was commonly used to make this paper, this parchment. You would use calves, goats, and sheep, sometimes deer, but calves, goats, and sheep were the most common animal used to make this type of paper. And I'll say more on the actual process of making this in future videos. Now, how and where did I purchase this leaf? Well, I purchased this leaf on eBay and I won it at auction. I paid actually much less than what the going rate is for this type of leaf. I paid out the door $383 for it. I was really surprised that I got it for that low. I have another one that I went at auction for, and I was in a bidding war with it, and I ended up paying, I think, closer to $600 for it. But this one here, I was very pleased to have gotten it for like under $400. That is a steal for one of these manuscripts, especially with those miniatures on it. It's hard to come by, much rarer, and so that's really good price for it. A lot of times I've found several websites that have these types of artistic leaves on there, and they're asking over $2,000 for them. So the fact that I got it for just about $400 is quite amazing, but definitely something that's very interesting, and I'm very, very thankful for, because I don't have all the money in the world, and so I can't be spending a crazy amount on these leaves. I actually never thought I'd be able to afford one of these because I couldn't really bring myself to pay $2,000 for something, especially when I had other ones like it, just not with the miniatures on it. So very glad I have this one, very thankful to have it in my collection, and I truly do love it. But yeah, that's what I got for this leaf. Of course, there's a lot more that could be said. There's a lot more details that I can go into, but I'll make sure that I go over that more in other videos that I have going here. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you checking this video out. If you aren't subscribed, please consider doing so, liking the video, share this with anyone who you think would find this interesting. So thanks again for checking this out, and be sure to stick around for the close-up shots after. See you guys in the next video.